The first great Italians, the Etruscans. Volsinii, 264 BCE. In 264 BCE, one of the most brutal actions in the early history of the Roman state and its expansion to control much of the known world occurred. That year, a Roman army under Marcus Fulvius Flaccus descended on the city of Volsinii in Etruria, modern-day Tuscany. The city was one of the foremost urban centers of the Etruscan League, a loose coalition of cities that had dominated Etruria, the region broadly coterminous with Tuscany today, for several centuries. The Etruscans' days were numbered, though. For over 2 centuries, the Roman-Etruscan Wars had gradually seen the Roman Republic acquire influence here and then broadly begin to conquer the Etruscans. Volsinii was one of the last holdouts. After years of sponsoring a pro-Roman party amongst the citizens of Volsinii, the Romans had been disappointed to see a party opposed to their rise to power in the city and had responded by waging war on Volsinii in 265 BCE. A year later, Flaccus arrived with his army. A short siege followed, at the end of which the people of Volsinii surrendered. Then the Romans did what they did everywhere. They engaged in wealth extraction, carrying off anything of value from the city, enslaving some of its people, and then appointing a magistrate to rule the area on their behalf. Legend has it that the first captive gladiators to ever fight in an amphitheater in Rome were men who were enslaved at Volsinii. This might seem like a fairly rudimentary act of aggression for an ancient state like Rome, but there is something striking about it. The Etruscans were now reduced to the status of a subject people, whereas the Romans, as is very well known, went on to conquer most of the world that was known to them. Yet the Etruscans were much the more sophisticated culture at the time of the Roman-Etruscan Wars. They were developing literature, artwork, and architecture that far eclipsed anything the Romans were producing between the 6th and 4th centuries BCE. Indeed, the early culture of the Roman Republic as it expanded in the 5th, 4th, and 3rd centuries BCE was hugely influenced by that of the Etruscans. These inhabitants of ancient Etruria, then, might be considered the first great Italian civilization. Let's take a look at what they did and how they lived. Etruscan origins. While we can be very precise about how Etruscan culture came to an end under a wave of conquests of their cities by the Romans in the first half of the 3rd century BCE, their origins are a bit less obscure, though the broad outlines are relatively clear after many years of archaeological inquiry. The Etruscan civilization evolved out of the earlier Villanovan culture. This in turn developed from the Proto-Villanovan culture and then from the Urnfield culture of Central Europe. Thus, the Etruscans were unusual in being a people who emerged as a major Iron Age culture whose roots did not lie in the Eastern Mediterranean or the Middle East, but rather in Europe, north of the Alps. The Villanovans had moved south of the Alps by 1000 BCE and began to settle many towns around north-central Italy, what we call Tuscany, and the Emilia-Romagna regions today. They introduced ironworking to Italy and a distinct form of cremation and funerary practices. From this culture, the Etruscan civilization began to emerge by about 800 BCE. It would soon take on its own distinct features based on absorption and refashioning of cultural practices that arrived from the Greek colonies of southern Italy. The term Etruscan was one which would have been unfamiliar to the Etruscans themselves. It is derived from the Roman reference to the region the Etruscans lived in as Etruria. Periods of Etruscan history. Etruscan history is broadly divisible into 4 periods. The first period, which we have just seen, involved the emergence of Etruscan culture out of the preceding Villanovan culture between the 11th and 9th centuries BCE. The second took place roughly between 800 BCE and 550 BCE and involved a major flourishing of Etruscan society and culture. During this period, the Etruscans began to develop an advanced culture, one notable for the quality of their art and sculpture, as we'll see more about presently, and also their urban development. It is evident that much of this was influenced by contact with the Greek colonies that had proliferated in southern Italy and Sicily, a part of the Mediterranean, which became known as Magna Graecia, Greater Greece, in recognition of how Hellenized the region became. However, while the Etruscans adopted many elements of Greek culture, they did not slavishly follow them either, developing their own uniquely Italianate versions of what they found attractive about Greek art and society. The third broad period of Etruscan history then occurred between 550 BCE and 400 BCE. This was the peak of Etruscan civilization. The foremost examples of Etruscan art, sculpture, and architecture date to this period, and their cultural output was at its height. It was followed by the fourth and last period, running from roughly 400 BCE to a very distinct terminal date in 264 BCE, when the Romans conquered the city of Volsinii and reduced Etruria to Roman rule. This final stage of Etruscan history was marked by decline as the Romans expanded and engaged in near-continuous warfare with their northern neighbors in the cities of Etruria. Political system. The Etruscans did not live within a unified, centralized state. There was not a single government here operating from some city that ruled over the others. Instead, this was more like a loose confederacy of city-states with a common culture, much like the situation that prevailed far to the east in Greece during the same era. These city-states were numerous and extended over a wide area. Although the heartland of Etruria was modern-day Tuscany, Etruscan colonies and cities were also found further south into the Latium and Lazio region, and to the northeast in what we now term the Emilia-Romagna region of Italy. Some of the most important city-states were Volsinii, Veii, Tarquinii, Felathri, Perusna, Velathri, and Arimna, many of which are forerunners of contemporary Italian cities like Perugia and Rimini. The Roman historian Livy described Aritum, modern-day Arezzo, as the capital of the Etruscan civilization. The cities and towns followed a historical and political development which will be familiar to anyone acquainted with how the Greek city-states evolved over time. A large proportion began as monarchies before moving towards becoming oligarchic democracies, sometimes with periods of dictatorship in the middle, which was the general drift of the government of many of the Greek city-states further east between the 8th and 5th centuries BCE. By the 6th century BCE or so, a loose league of 12 of the most important Etruscan cities had come into existence, known today as the Dodecapolis, from the Greek for 12 cities. The membership of the league did not remain static, and cities seem to have come and gone. Thus, the Etruscans, much like the Greeks further east and the Phoenicians before them, were not a unified power or state, but rather a loose coalition of cities and minor states with a common culture. Etruscan religion and society. Etruscan society was clan-based, meaning that people belonged to kinship groups which often extended back hundreds of years. They used double and sometimes triple barrel names, which identified a person through a first name or praenomen, and also through the Etruscan equivalent of a surname, a nomen gentile as the Romans would later call it, one which identified the clan name. Sometimes a third name identifying one's direct line of descent from a mother or father was included too. This naming system was copied by the Romans, yet another feature of Roman society and culture derived from the Etruscans. It points towards the hierarchical and traditional nature of Etruscan society, one in which rich and poor were delineated by lines of descent. Though these must surely have become blurred over time as rich people lost their wealth and poor people gained it, much the same way the difference between the aristocratic patricians and the plebeian commoners broke down over time in Rome. A major feature of Etruscan life was their piety. The prevalence of funerary tombs and votive offerings from the Etruscan cities indicates a major dedication to the gods and goddesses. These were polytheists who believed in a large pantheon of goddesses and gods. It was an immanent religion, meaning that like the Greeks, Romans, and others, they believed that natural phenomena were under the control of certain deities, and that these gods controlled whether the harvest failed, the sun shone, or a ship made it back to port without being destroyed in a storm. Votive offerings were made at temples and shrines to appease the gods. One thing which made the Battle of Volsinii in 264 BCE and the capture of that city so significant was that the Fanum Voltumnae, the shrine of Voltumna, the chief god of the Etruscan pantheon, was found in Volsinii, making it a site comparable to the Oracle of Delphi in the Greek world in terms of its religious significance. Voltumna was a deity of the underworld, while also being a god of war. Other important deities included Usil, the goddess of the sun, Tiver, the god of the moon, Thalna, the god of trade, and Fufluns, the god of wine. Maris, a child deity that may have been a god of love, was a possible source for the Roman god of war, Mars. Like all the immanent polytheistic religions of the Mediterranean, a complex mythology of stories involved the gods developed amongst the Etruscans. Etruscan art. Etruscan civilization, above all other things, is known for how advanced their art was. Two elements of this are particularly noteworthy. Beginning around 675 BCE, the Etruscans began to produce what is now called Bouke ceramics, a word which means odorous clay on account of the clay used having a distinct smell. The Etruscans produced a vast array of drinking and storage vessels from this clay, which has a distinctly blackish color to it. These were elaborately designed and decorated, often shaping handles or other elements thereof into animal figures or carving scenes from Etruscan or Greek mythology onto the body of the pottery. These became more elegant over time, such that by the 5th century BCE, the Etruscans were producing wine vessels, goblets, and other pieces of ceramics which could often rival their Greek contemporaries being produced in the Eastern Mediterranean. As significant as the Bouke ceramics were, the peak of Etruscan art was its statuary and sculpture. This evolved from rather crude stick figurines and fertility statues during the Villanovan era to become remarkably detailed and anatomically accurate statues by the 6th, 5th, and 4th centuries BCE. A huge proportion of these were funerary objects that appeared on the tombs of the era or on temples. They borrowed from many different traditions. For instance, we find sphinxes in Etruscan statuary, as well as statues that are clearly influenced by Greek designs. Yet they also had their own unique Etruscan dimensions. The sarcophagus of the spouses, a terracotta funerary monument, which dates back to around 520 BCE and which is housed in the Etruscan Museum in Rome today, is perhaps the finest example of this statuary. Standing nearly 4 foot tall and being over 6 foot wide, it depicts a man and woman on a divan or reclining couch, their faces peculiarly expressive and happy-looking for a funerary monument. Etruscan literature. Unfortunately, our understanding of Etruscan literature and their written output is far inferior to what we know about their artistic abilities. Virtually no Etruscan literature or books written by Etruscan writers have survived, a development which must be attributed to the later cultural hegemony of the Romans, who were largely only interested in preserving Greek texts and made no effort to copy out and preserve written works by other conquered peoples like the Etruscans and Carthaginians. Nevertheless, we do know quite a bit about the Etruscan language from some 13,000 inscriptions that have been found at various places around Italy, on border stones, in burial tombs, on temple walls, and in other places where the Etruscans inscribed public records on stone stelae and walls. These indicate that the Etruscan language was probably an isolated language, one which was not an Indo-European language, but had roots much further back in time, the same way that Basque is an isolated language in Europe today, one unrelated to any language spoken around it. Because of this, scholars still struggle today to translate Etruscan inscriptions, the language being only partially understood. Still, the Etruscans were influenced in the formation of their written alphabet by the Greek alphabet. While the roughly 13,000 extant Etruscan inscriptions shed considerable light on Etruscan culture and history, they give no real insight into the personality of individual Etruscans. The Linen Book of Zagreb. A striking exception to the lack of Etruscan literary texts is the Liber Linteus Zagrabiensis, the Linen Book of Zagreb, arguably the oldest extant physical book from Europe. The text was produced on a piece of linen used for writing on. Carbon dating and other scientific methods have been used to conclude that the linen was produced not long after 400 BCE in the Tuscany region near Arezzo, though the text itself was probably written down over a century later. It is a ritual calendar, a literary type common in the ancient Mediterranean, in which the festivals and days of worship of the gods and goddesses were described, and how one might go about making offerings to have the gods look favorably on them. So, for instance, a common feature of such ritual calendars would have been how to make offerings to the gods or goddesses of fertility and the harvest during harvest time in order to ensure a good harvest. There are some 230 lines of text on the linen book, making it a substantial discovery. It has survived in a most unusual fashion. The linen that the text was written on was discovered wrapped around a mummy which a Croatian named Mihajlo Baric purchased in the city of Alexandria in northern Egypt in 1848. He took it home to what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it is housed in the Archaeological Museum in Zagreb, hence its name. It is believed that the linen that the text was written on must have been recycled and somehow ended up being traded to Egypt in the 3rd century BCE from Italy, where it was then used in the mummification of the mummy that now rests in Zagreb. It is strange the way some historical texts survive. The Monteleone Chariot. Perhaps the finest artifact of Etruscan culture to have survived down to the present day is the Monteleone Chariot, housed today in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Back in 1902, a farmer in the Etruria was developing his land when he began to try and reduce a small mound in a field to make it more level with the surrounding land. He soon discovered that far from being a natural formation, the hill was in fact an artificially built mound tomb. He eventually dug through into the tomb and discovered a range of funerary goods, the central piece of which was a full-sized, ornately decorated bronze chariot. What has since come to be known as the Monteleone Chariot was not used for warfare. It was a ceremonial or parade chariot, one which would have been used for civic events in one of the Etruscan cities and towns, and which was decorated accordingly with scenes from the Trojan War cast into the bronze. When taken as a whole, they depict the great warrior Achilles' life story, from his youth to the war itself. These are cast in bronze panels around the car itself of the chariot, the main structure on which the rider of the chariot would have stood. Some of this was inlaid with ivory. Dating to around 550 BCE, the Monteleone chariot is one of the best preserved ancient chariots to have been found anywhere in the world, and also points towards the adoption of cultural forms from the Eastern Mediterranean by the Etruscans, both in terms of the use of chariots and the stories depicted on the car. The Chimera of Arezzo. The Monteleone chariot has a close competitor for the title of the most striking piece of Etruscan metalwork to have survived down to modern times. The Chimera of Arezzo was discovered in 1553 by construction workers working in the city of Arezzo, a city which, as we saw earlier, was described as the foremost of the Etruscan cities by the Roman historian Livy. It is housed in the Museo Archeologico Nazionale in Florence today. The statue is nearly a meter tall and 1¼ meters wide. Cast from bronze, it depicts a chimera, a monster from Greek mythology, which was described as being a mix of a lion or wild goat and a sea creature. It could breathe fire and was descended from two other, much larger Greek mythological monsters, Typhon and Echidna. The statue has been described as one of the finest pieces of bronze sculpture to have survived from the ancient world, with the torso closely mirroring the anatomy of a large cat, most likely modeled on a lion, while the bronze casting of the face, mane, spine, and paws are all very intricate. Produced as a religious offering around 400 BCE, it is a testament to Etruscan culture at a time when the Romans were still a good century and a half away from beginning to produce anything of any real note from a cultural perspective. The Roman-Etruscan Wars. There is no doubt that the Etruscans were the most advanced people culturally in central Italy by the 5th century BCE. However, being culturally sophisticated is no guarantee of survival. To the south, a more rustic and crude society was emerging, one which, while not known yet for anything even remotely cultured, was a well-managed state geared for warfare. Around 500 BCE, a string of developments took place at Rome, a growing city on the banks of the river Tiber in the Latium region to the south of Etruria. First, the Romans seem to have decided to dispense with their monarchy, and then they developed an effective republican government, one with a coherent legal system and a citizen militia. Soon they were expanding, engaging in wars with their nearest neighbors in central Italy. Some of these early conflicts involved the Etruscan cities and towns. Indeed, the last king of Rome, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, had relatives in the Etruscan cities of Veii and Tarquinii, and sought support in Etruria after he was deposed in Rome to try and reclaim his crown. He would never succeed in this. More broadly, though, these events can be seen as marking the beginning of the long-running Roman-Etruscan Wars. The Roman-Etruscan Wars would last for 2½ centuries. They were not sustained engagements. Instead, sporadic conflicts emerged between Rome and its allies, and some of the Etruscan cities and towns every few years or decades. The peak of these was in the middle of the 4th century BCE, when the Romans ended up at war with Etruscan cities like Tarquinii, Caere, and Falerii. The general course of these is shadowy, hampered by the fact that we really only have one major source for them: the Roman historian Livy, who was necessarily biased in his account and also writing at a remove of hundreds of years from the events he purported to describe. What emerges from his account and fragmentary ancillary evidence was that the Romans managed to defeat the Etruscan cities individually through sustained military action. The failure of the Etruscans to unite until it was too late cost them dearly. A major engagement at the Battle of Volterra in 298 BCE was the last time the Etruscans posed any real threat to the Romans. final defeat came at Volsinii 34 years later. The after story. Etruria and the Etruscan cities and towns were one of the first regions brought under Roman rule. They were, in many ways, the first people to conquer the Romans culturally. It's well appreciated today that when the Romans conquered the eastern Mediterranean in the 2nd century BCE, they might have brought the Greeks of this part of the world under their control. But the Greeks, in the end, conquered Rome culturally, with the Romans adopting everything from Greek philosophical systems to their education curricula. This was not the first time this had happened. After they conquered the Etruscans, the Romans adopted many of the things which they found in Etruria. These included things like gladiatorial contests, chariot racing, and advanced hydraulics to deliver water into their cities and towns, all of which were features of Etruscan society before they ever arrived to Rome. While the Romans would develop these things tenfold over the centuries, the Colosseum, the Circus Maximus, and the aqueducts were all in many ways things which the Romans inherited from the Etruscans. The Etruscans themselves remained a subject people for centuries, until, like all other Italians, they were granted Roman citizenship en masse after the Social War of 91 BCE to 87 BCE. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and we'll see you in the next one.